Events, it's inspiring for me to be in a room filled with so many social justice advocates, housing justice advocates, people who have dedicated their professional lives to making homes affordable to the lowest income people, like each one of you here in this room. And it's especially inspiring during such uncertain and tumultuous times, when the threats to affordable housing programs, really to the entire social safety net, are more significant than they've been in decades. And I think that's part of the reason why it's good to come together in this way to reaffirm and recognize that we are all united in our knowledge that we can end homelessness, we can end housing poverty. And even in the face of severe threats to programs that provide one of life's basic necessities, a home, to some of the lowest income people in the country, we never waver from that knowledge and from that commitment. And the threats certainly are significant here in the state and nationally. When it comes to potential cuts to housing programs, things haven't been as dire as since 1974, back when Cushing Dolbear founded the National Low-Income Housing Coalition in response to President Nixon's moratorium on the creation of affordable homes. And less than a decade later was when President Reagan dramatically slashed funding for affordable housing programs, ushering in a new modern phenomenon of homelessness, with thousands of people sleeping in shelters and in cars on the streets. And it was years after those short-sighted and devastating cuts that a major infusion of resources were needed to manage this new phenomenon of homelessness that had been created. Since that time, we've never recovered the same levels of funding for deeply targeted housing programs that we had back then. And those were a level of cuts that were unprecedented before that time, and they remained so since until today. So today, at a time when the United States is spending more on its military than the next 8 top military spending countries combined, President Trump wants to increase military spending by tens of billions of dollars, paid for by eliminating or drastically cutting much of the country's social safety net for low-income seniors and veterans, people with disabilities, families with kids struggling to get by. And these proposed cuts come at a time when the housing crisis has reached historic heights, most negatively impacting the lowest income people. Today, federal housing programs serve approximately 5 million low-income households, but the needs of many more families go unmet, as you all know very well. Those who receive housing subsidies literally won a housing lottery to get that assistance. And there's only 1 out of every 4 families who receive the help that they need. Nationally, there is a shortage of 7.4 million homes, affordable and available for the lowest income people. Here in Connecticut, that means for every 100 extremely low income households, there are just 36 homes that are affordable and available to them. And so because of this housing lottery system, over 8 million deeply poor households live in housing poverty. They are 1 illness, 1 divorce, 1 paycheck away from homelessness. They face threats of eviction, poor housing conditions, and they're severely cost-burdened, paying 50, 70, up to 90% of their income each month just to have a home. So the gap between wages and rents is growing. Homelessness in some communities is increasing. And in this context, President Trump proposed deep cuts to vital resources that make home affordable to those lowest income households. And these cuts would have a devastating impact on millions across the country. His budget would mean more than 250,000 seniors, families, people with disabilities who have Section 8 vouchers today losing that assistance, putting them at immediate risk of eviction or homelessness. President Trump wants to gut the public housing program, a crucial source of affordable homes for millions of Americans, at a time when the public housing capital needs backlog is upwards of $40 billion. He would eliminate home and CDBG, starving local communities of the funding they need to build and repair affordable homes and to revitalize distressed communities. And at a time when these programs and their infrastructure for overseeing the programs is critical to the country's ability to respond to housing needs after a disaster, like Hurricanes Irma and Harvey and Maria. He would eliminate the National Housing Trust Fund, the first new housing resource in a generation exclusively targeted to building housing affordable for the lowest income people. And the list, unfortunately, goes on. He would eliminate the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. He would eliminate the Legal Services Corporation, which is often the only resource available to low-income people to avoid unwarranted evictions. He would even eliminate the low-income home energy assistance program that literally keeps the heat on during cold winters in the homes of seniors and families with young kids. So these proposed cuts clearly are unacceptable. And there's a couple of important things to keep in mind about this budget proposal. And the first is that despite the spin, this budget clearly has nothing to do with reducing the deficit. It's simply about increasing military spending at the expense of resources serving struggling households across the country. And the second and most important thing to know about this budget is that we can and we will, and in fact we are, stopping these harmful cuts from being enacted. So the work that many of you in this room have done together with the Connecticut Housing Coalition and with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition over the spring and the summer is having a real impact. At the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, we lead the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, which is a coalition of over 70 national housing and community development partners who come together to work towards the highest possible spending level for HUD and USDA programs. And together with CHCDF and with our state and local partners, this summer the National Low-Income Housing Coalition led the Our Homes, Our Voices Week of Action. And Our Homes, Our Voices is about demanding action on the affordable housing crisis. It's about building a movement for affordable homes. We had over 60 events across the country attended by thousands of people representing tens of thousands more, demanding affordable homes for the lowest income people. And the Week of Action was about urging Congress and the country, instead of reducing our nation's investment in affordable homes, we must make a bold and sustained commitment to ensure that everyone has a safe, accessible home. The campaign generated tens of dozens of national local media stories, thousands of messages to members of Congress, tens of thousands of tweets, and none of this would have been possible without the early and committed support of people like Jude and Florence at the Connecticut Housing Coalition, who they and the entire Connecticut Housing Coalition team were among the first to really spring into action when we announced the beginnings of this campaign. And they hosted a very successful press conference in Hartford with community stakeholders. I'm guessing many of you participated, and with Governor Malloy, who clearly has been a long champion of affordable housing and community development. So I want to thank Jude and Florence for their leadership and for everybody at the Connecticut Housing Coalition for helping to make that event and those events like it across the country a success, because these actions and others like them are working. This year's budget isn't final yet, but at this stage in the game, we know that both the House and the Senate, on a bipartisan basis, have resoundingly rejected President Trump's devastating cuts. And they're doing so on a bipartisan basis, and they're doing so for this year, and if we keep it up, for the years to come. So your voices and your action really is making a difference, and we need to keep it going. And part of what I think makes this moment in time so remarkable is that in addition to the very real threats to these critical affordable housing programs, we also have before us tremendous opportunity to advance towards our mission of affordable homes for everyone. Cushing Dolbear started talking and writing about the need to rebalance federal housing policy back in 1974. For years, she shared the injustice, the inequities, the absurdities of the mortgage interest deduction. And it turned out on that issue, she was well before her time. But her tenacious advocacy and research started to turn the tide, and continued dedication to rebalancing federal housing policy taken up by other leaders over time, people like Ron Terwilliger and Keith Ellison, Chairman David Camp, and Representative Barbara Lee, and others, have slowly, surely, steadily chipped away at the mythology built up around the deduction, revealing it for what it is, an ineffective, highly regressive, and poorly targeted use of scarce federal resources. Did you know that 15% of the mortgage interest deduction's benefits go to the top 1% of earners in this country? That means as taxpayers, every year we spend $10.5 billion to subsidize the homes of some of the wealthiest people in the world. That kind of waste can't be justified, especially in an environment of proposals to slash programs that support America's poorest families. So the National Low-Income Housing Coalition leads the United for Homes campaign with over 2,300 organizations endorsing throughout the country. And we urge common sense reforms to the mortgage interest deduction that would give a tax break to 25 million low and middle income homeowners and save tens of billions of dollars to be reinvested into rental housing solutions for the lowest income people. So for years, clearly the mortgage interest deduction was considered a third rail program, right? Touch it at your peril. But it's shifted now, and there have been for years now bipartisan proposals to reform the mortgage interest deduction. And House and Senate Republicans and key leaders in the White House are actively considering changes to the mortgage interest deduction today. So our biggest challenge now is to ensure that that savings, $240 billion over 10 years, goes back into rental housing for the people that most need it, and not to pay for further tax breaks for corporations. So for years, people have said changing the mortgage interest deduction is impossible. It can never happen. I think generally there's some agreement now that it can happen. So now people often say that putting those savings into rental housing is what's impossible. But we have to remind ourselves that it is possible, and in fact, it's been done before. It's very similar to how the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program was created. Back in 1986, when we had comprehensive tax reform then, there were several ineffective, untargeted, uncapped housing tax expenditures that were eliminated. And the housing field came together and demanded that these housing dollars stay in housing programs and be more effective and better targeted than the housing tax expenditures that were eliminated. And so the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program was created. And it's time for us to do it again. We can't allow housing dollars to be used to pay for corporate tax breaks. We continue to face the same powerful opponents that we've faced for decades. They're spending tens of millions of dollars to defend this indefensible system. And we certainly don't have their money, but we have people, and together we can be even more powerful. So if you haven't yet endorsed the United for Homes campaign, I encourage you to. We need to join together on this. And of course, I can't guarantee that Congress can actually get this done, that Congress will achieve comprehensive tax reform, or if they do, that they'll reform the mortgage interest deduction. But I know for sure that over the last 30 years, neither have been more possible than they are right now, and we must seize this opportunity. And there'll be other opportunities to expand resources for housing for the lowest income people. At some point, Congress must address the housing finance system through comprehensive GSE reform. And when they do, we'll work to significantly expand the National Housing Trust Fund program. They may work on an infrastructure spending package, and when they do, we'll remind them that housing is infrastructure and work again to expand the Housing Trust Fund, to increase funding for public housing capital repairs, to expand, improve, and more deeply target the low-income housing tax credit. And with recent hurricanes devastating communities in the United States, we must work together to ensure that Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands all can repair and rebuild equitably and completely. So we are at a tipping point in this crisis, and we can choose to end homelessness and housing poverty. We have the data, we have a clear understanding of the need, we have the solutions, proven and effective programs to affordably house the poorest families. And we have the resources. We can afford to do this. We lack only the political will to fund the solutions at the scale necessary to solve the crisis. And building the political will starts with all of us, educating the public and members of Congress and expanding our coalitions to go beyond affordable housing and community development fields. So what gives me the biggest sense of optimism, the greatest sense of hope in this moment, is the new partnerships that are being forged, the broader coalitions that we are actively building. Research has grown in recent years, making clear the positive impacts that affordable homes have on health outcomes, on educational attainment, on lifetime earnings, on life expectancy. And so leaders from these other sectors are increasingly engaging in the advocacy to make homes affordable. Dr. Megan Sandel is a pediatrician out of Boston from Children's Health Watch, and she's been a leader in bringing doctors and other healthcare professionals to join us in our advocacy for affordable homes. She calls affordable housing a vaccine, protecting kids against a variety of societal ills. Recently, the American Academy of Pediatrics published a paper strongly making the case that housing is healthcare and calling for a major investment in expanding the Section 8 voucher program. And teachers are speaking out on the need for affordable homes too. Major education industry groups that come to DC every year with tens of thousands of teachers are recognizing the challenges that a lack of affordable housing has on their classrooms. They're seeing enough kids churning in and out of their classrooms because of housing instability to recognize the impact that's having on those kids, on their family, and on the entire classroom. And so they're speaking out on the need for more affordable homes. And of course, Matt Desmond's research and writing, his book Evicted, brought new credibility and attention to the role of stable, affordable homes in alleviating poverty. So we have a broad and powerful coalition that is coalescing around the housing needs of the poorest people in America, because we recognize more and more that if we care about poverty, economic mobility, inequality, if we care about healthcare, education, transportation, nutrition, if we care about local jobs and local economies, then the solutions start with home. So I want to leave you with just one last thing to remember in what has been a really tumultuous time in all of the turmoil and in the chaos and in the moments of real uncertainty. We should remember that we are moving forward. On the first day of this session, when the new Congress had just been sworn into office, the first act of the conservative wing of House Republicans was an attempt to roll back their own oversight and transparency laws. Collectively, we were outraged. We shone a spotlight on their action, flooded their offices with calls, and we won. President Trump last spring sent up to Congress, in addition to the proposed cuts that I talked about before, another request to cut deeper into the social safety net in order to pay for a wall along the Mexican border. And Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, quickly said no. They rejected, and similarly rejected in the budget, his proposed cuts in a bipartisan fashion and fully funded housing and other social safety net programs. And after 7 years of hammering the need to repeal the Affordable Care Act, President Trump stepped into the White House and aggressively pushed a bill that would take away health care for 24 million people, that would roll back the Medicaid expansion and dramatically reduce resources for the supportive housing services essential to ending homelessness, and they've failed spectacularly. And each time, they failed because they underestimated you. They underestimated us. They underestimated our perseverance, our tenacity, our willingness to call, to email, to show up, to march. And they underestimate our insistence on nothing less than equity and social justice. And that's exactly why we'll continue to advance our mission towards ending homelessness and housing poverty. We will succeed because we are on the side of justice. And as Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe bends toward it. But as we all know, that arc doesn't bend on its own, and that's where we come in. Many of us here today represent dozens or hundreds or thousands more people who are dedicated to the same cause. Our commitment to ending homelessness and housing poverty is unwavering, and knowing that there are tens of thousands of us across the country uniting behind this cause and that our numbers are ever growing makes me confident we will prevail in the end. So thank you for your good work, for your commitment, and for your advocacy now and in the years to come. It's never been more important. Thank you.
Diane has been gracious enough to agree to answer questions. So if anybody has any questions, Allison and Jude are roaming around with the mic, so please.
Don't be shy.
Thank you, and thank you for your inspiring speech. This actually is a question for Commissioner Klein, who is still here, I think. And it comes from, my name is Amy Epler-Epstein. I'm at New Haven Legal Assistance, and in the wonderful morning conference sessions, was talking to one of my colleagues in Connecticut Legal Services who pointed out one of the really low cost and great homeless prevention programs that our state used to have, but the funding which has been cut, and that's two programs, a security deposit program and the eviction prevention funds that really were not a large budget item, but were so effective in saving so many families from preventing their becoming homeless. And so since we have this gathering here and all these advocates, I wondered if you might be able to address for us the possibility of getting that back in DOH's budget in the future, both of those areas.
Sure. Thank you for that question. You know, we've had to make very difficult choices, and we've been very creative in being able to help folks get housed and stay housed. So we've been able to do that in other ways. So yes, this is a program that has been cut, and we will need to work within those cuts for those programs.